Hey, what's up, guys? This is Mr. James here, back with day 2 of Sides of Jackson, part 2. Thank you for tuning in on yesterday for Sides of Jackson part 1, where we talked about his personality in terms of Jackson as the self-made man, Jackson as the superstar war hero, Jackson as the duel master, Jackson the party animal, and Jackson the politician. So then this kind of picks up with Jackson the politician because he ends up running for presidency. And then these next slides observe his presidency in terms of some of the things that he had to deal with once he was elected in 1828. So again, the essential question is the same thing. What were the sides of Andrew Jackson, and how did they impact his presidency? And his nickname being Old Hickory, and this being named because he was as tough as a hickory stick. So on the next slide, we have the Jackson topics. Jackson is President Thompson's presidential goals, Battle of the Banks, Nullification Process, law enforcement, and Indian removal. So on this first slide, as Jackson is President Part 1, we talk about his presidential goals. All right, he wanted to lower the federal debt, and he was successful at doing that. Attempts to get rid of the Electoral College, he felt like it did not give the true power to the people to elect the president, especially the first election that he had lost. He vowed to get in and get that change. That did not happen, but he also basically reinforced the spoil system. And you see that it says nothing new right there. Basically, this started with George Washington. George Washington grabbed his buddies and he had them serve on his cabinet to help him run the country. So it got named the kitchen cabinet because this became known as helping out friends and everyday people and giving them a chance to work and help him run the country. So Jackson is President Part 2, the Battle of the Banks. So, with every presidency, it's always some sort of economic issue that they have to deal with, and Jackson was no different. Jackson does not like the national bank, gives too much power to the national government, and again, this question asks who else felt this way. And so you have to go back to when Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton battled it out. And remember, Alexander Hamilton won that debate, and Washington signed off on the national bank. So Jefferson felt that way. He vetoes or cancels the bank's charter. So then what ends up happening is many hopes this would be the end of Jackson, but his battle against the bank actually increased his popularity because, again, the bank challenged the Constitution. It challenged the word. If you think about his personality, he was an aggressive person, so that kind of made him more popular. On the next slide, we have Jackson's President Part 3. With this, he had the nullification process. And nullification was nullify was one of your vocabulary words. And again, that means to claim something as void. So if Mr. James says, do your homework, and you don't do it, you nullified my order to do your homework. So I know you know what that word means. Anyways, crisis centered around the tariff of abomination. Now, if you think about the word abomination is like huge, massive, like something that is just almost engulfs worlds, right? And then the tariff is a tax on goods, okay? So what ends up happening is there's a huge tariff that is passed that ended up helping the northern states because it kept trade inside of the United States, kept the foreign countries out because we would charge them so much. Well, of course, the southern states had something say about this because they felt like this tariff favored the northern states. Well, of course, guess what they did? South Carolina took the lead and they wanted to nullify the tariff. They were supported by Jackson's Vice President John C. Calhoun. So even Jackson's buddy, who was the vice president, said, that might be a little bit too much, bruh. You might be pushing the people just a little too far. So people in South Carolina began to riot and rebel. And remember, we don't like rebellion. There's lots of a rebellion. So this next slide talks about law enforcement and how Jackson decided to respond. He threatens to send the military down to the states to enforce the laws of this huge tariff. Okay. Well, before this happens, and this is a great example of checks and balances. As you know, Congress is part of the legislative branch, and of course, President Jackson, Vice President John C. Calhoun are part of the executive branch. There are ways to check one another, and Congress agreed with the people. They said, you know what, this tariff is hurting us, and it is making us fall apart. So we're going to go ahead and lower it. And then, of course, South Carolina says, hey, thank you for listening to us, but don't think that we won't use our power to nullify again in the future. That's a right that we have. Crisis was avoided for that point. And right here on this final slide, this might be one of the things that Andrew Jackson is remembered for the most, the Indian removal. So Jackson was in 100% support of American settlers claiming and living on new land in the West that still belonged to many native tribes. So as the 1820s passed, more and more Americans wanted to move west. And the land that we had up until that point was just up into the Mississippi River. And then I guess to the Colorado Rockies because we had the Louisiana Territory, but we wanted to go even further west than that. And many natives lived there. So in 1830, President Jackson pushed through Congress the Indian Removal Act. So he actually made it an illegal law that Americans can go in and take lands from natives. So there's a specific group, the Cherokee Nation, who fought back, and they said, hold up, man, you can't just walk up in our place and take our stuff. That's not fair. And it actually took the state of Georgia to the U.S. Supreme Court and sued for their land in Worcester versus Georgia. Well, basically, what ended up happening is they lost the battle and were forced to walk on this horrific journey from Georgia to present-day Oklahoma. And this was known as the Trail of Tears. Many natives died. Their bodies were left dead on the trail. It was cold. It was long. And it was one of the, the shameful parts of our U.S. history. And that was part of Jackson's presidency. So Trail of Tears was also a vocab word for you guys. And Indian Removal Act was also just so that you can get some background. In the next couple of days, we're going to spend more time looking into the Indian removal situation and getting more details with that. So in review, before our last slide, we talked about Jackson as president, and the topics we had were his presidential goals, like lowering the national debt, battle of the banks, and him keeping the banks, or nullifying the bank's charter, and the nullification process, and South Carolina trying to fight back with the nullifying action, law enforcement threatening to even send the military on his own people, and then also now Indian removal, which we just spent a little time on. So here's what you get to do, okay? And this is important. So what you now get to do is basically address that essential question. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your sides of Jackson, part 1, and pick one side of Jackson. And then what you're going to do is you're going to write a few sentences and explain how that side of Jackson matches up with any part of his presidency that we just discussed, and how it was an example of that side of Jackson. Okay, so this might require you to think a little bit. So I'll give you a specific example, okay, or a model here. Let's just say that Jackson being a superstar war hero. Well, he literally threatened to take his own country to war over them nullifying his tariff. And so maybe that's attributed to him being, such a war-driven person. So something like that is what we're thinking about. Okay, so make sure you're writing complete sentences using great writing skills. And yeah, you guys did a great job yesterday. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And stay safe out there. Later.